Can I just, before, maybe I'll be presenting myself first, and then I'd love to hear a little bit from you why you are joining this webinar. And then we'll hit, the bulk of it, because we have about half an hour. And then, I'd like to actually keep this presentation to about 20 minutes. So we have some time for questions and answers. So the topic today is the web, a little bit about the history of the web, a little bit of cybersecurity. Oh, hello, Ray. Hello, nice to see you again. How are you? Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Yes.
How are you? How is Dubai?
Fine. Good.
Very nice to see you again.
Yeah.
I think this time we're just about to start, and I was hoping that a few more students would join who have registered, as well as maybe Ina, whom you've met the other day. So I was just saying that we have roughly about 20 minutes of presentation, and then I want to have an interactive kind of exchange with you. So what I have prepared for today is a section on the little bit about the history of the web, and then I want to talk about cybersecurity and e-reputation. So my name is Dr. Viola Krebs. I'm the academic dean of UBIS. If you're not speaking, can you just mute, and I think I just did it, your microphones, because, and then of course, if we're having a Q&A session, then I need to hear you, obviously. And if I can see all of you, it's wonderful, because that makes it a lot more real. Like my son said yesterday, who, he's doing Zoom sessions, and he says, well, I've been talking to a computer. Of course, he's 6 years old, but it was kind of cute to hear him say that. Yes, I'm talking to a computer, but actually, no, I'm talking to you. And so it's a distinct pleasure to see that we have, in fact, a few participants, but participants from 3 different continents, which is nice. So we have Uganda, we have the Emirates, and we have Bulgaria. And I'll ask you to just say a few words about yourselves. But first, about myself. So I'm the academic dean of UBIS. I'm a lecturer in business and international relations, member of the UNESCO chair of the University of Strasbourg, and also I have previously I was a banker. At some point I worked a lot with international organizations, and I managed an organization for about 15 years, which I started from scratch. So that's about my background. When it comes to, and what it doesn't say here, my PhD is from University of Strasbourg, but also I've studied at University of Geneva, and I'm Genevan. So local, but international. So what about yourselves? What about our participant from Bulgaria? I don't want to repeat your name because I'm not sure I will say it properly.
Hi, sorry. It's Pamela, and I studied in England. I'm from England. I got a bachelor's in software engineering, and I moved to Bulgaria 6 months ago. And I'm just getting really interested in doing some more learning and advancing my education, which I never thought I'd do. So that's why I'm here, and I am interested in cybersecurity. I think in this day and age it's very important because everyone's trying to attack everyone and stuff.
Great, thanks so much, Pamela. Leticia, can we see you?
Yes. Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. Can you see me?
Yes,
I don't know.
we can see you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
my
fantastic.
name is Letitia. I'm Ugandan. I'm from Uganda. I'm very interested in the web, cybersecurity, and e-repetition because it's the in thing. I'm just interested in understanding more about it because it seems like the global community is now working basically under this. Contra is under that. I'm a writer with Bella Naija, one of the biggest African digital magazines. I write on different, mainly social aspects, social issues. I have a master's in international business from INSEC in France. And I'm also a prospective student to do a master's in international relations with UBIS in Geneva. I'm a part-time junior lecturer here in Uganda. I think that's all. That's all about me.
Okay. And it seems we have lost our third participant who said that he needed to do some launch. So I suppose it's going to be a female session today.
Okay.
Well, let me just give you a very brief intro to the web. Given, and please mute your microphones if you're not speaking, again, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. But keep your cameras because it's nice to see you. And then if you have any questions anywhere along the road, given this is a small forum, please feel free to actually interject. I'd be very happy to answer questions as we go along. So I just wanted to take you along a journey. The journey actually starts, well, I suppose it starts in the 60s with a project that starting to connect computers back then. A project that was launched really by the US Army at the time to distribute information in a secure way. But it's in the late 80s, or more specifically in 1989, that really a breaking action, something that would change the world as it stands, was put forward by a scientist, a British scientist. You see him here in the picture in the middle. His name is Tim Berners-Lee. So he put forward a proposal at CERN. CERN is the organization, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. Actually, it stands for initially European Center for Nuclear Research, but it was rebranded. The acronym stayed. It is located about 2 kilometers from where I am right now. And because this scientific lab, of course, needs a lot of computer power, they also have a very important computer lab. And this is where this proposal was written on a napkin, and you know, it kind of went from there. And the idea was to basically go beyond what had been developed previously by different scientists, but which stayed very much in the scientific community, to actually transform it into something called the World Wide Web. World Wide Web, like the spider web, something which would be decentralized and would use a code called HTTP. And so this HTTP, if you go to the back of any of the web pages, you will see that actually the basic language we are using, whatever browser we are using these days, is using HTTP. So when we talk about the web, cybersecurity, and e-reputation, we can say that at an outset, I think it's kind of interesting to quote Tim Berners-Lee for the occasion. This is a quote I got from him as I was writing my PhD, which is on a related topic about the web. And he said, what counts is not always what you can obtain from society, but how you participate in it. So I think actually this techie invention he put forward, and I think at the time he didn't really, he could feel that maybe it would lead to something important, but I think nobody at the time could really imagine how important it would be and how groundbreaking it would be for the world, globally, locally, at any level. So if we look a little bit at the time frame here, we can say that, by the way, the internet and the World Wide Web are not the same thing. The internet is the technology that has been put forward by the US Army, where you would use IP addresses to talk to other IP addresses. The World Wide Web basically came up with, or Tim Berners-Lee and Mr. Caillot, who was working with him, Robert Caillot, they came up with a technology that would make it easier to use this technology. So if you look at this timeline, you can see that, like in many instances when you have groundbreaking inventions, it's not one invention. There are a series of inventions that lead to something big. So in 1969, you had ARPANET, which is a Unix server developed in the US. Later, 1 year later, you had, in 1970, a protocol that is still used today, TCP/IP. So if you've got a computer, a PC, and if you ever have gone to the desktop item there for the computer, and you right-click with your mouse, and then you look what kind of network, what it says in the background, you will find TCP/IP somewhere. And that's because, well, that's the protocol that's used globally. I see actually, by the way, and I have to apologize, in this graph, somehow 1989, it should say World Wide Web, but I think, I don't know if it's, no, it's not on a different slide. So basically in 1989, that's when this proposal was put forward. A couple of years later, you had the last major element that led to the invention of how we know the web today, which was the first browser. You know that we are using different kinds of browsers these days. We have seen, maybe you have seen, different browsers coming in and out of use. You know, there was Mosaic, which was put forward and published in 1993. Then you had Netscape, then you had Internet Explorer, then you had, and these days we're using mostly Safari, Mozilla, and Chrome. But, you know, there might be others to come, who knows. Anyhow, in 1995, you had about 200 websites out there. If you look at the figures, you can see that, you know, a number of years later, in 2009, you had 2.4 billion users. And then yet later, you have now, in 2020, about 4.5 billion users out there. So it's a pretty amazing growth. And that technology loop and development has also come with the hardware, you know, that we make the distinction between hardware and software. So what you see here on the left of the screen in 1969 was the first Unix server or computer. In fact, it took up an entire room. And guess what? It roughly had less power than one of these. You know, this is a smartphone. It's like tiny, right? So we can do so many things with those devices nowadays. We can also see that on the software. So we make the distinction between hardware, any kind of item, whether it's this size or the one we saw that takes an entire room. That's called hardware. Then we have the software part, any kind of platform that is being used, any kind of application that is being used and will be integrated into our hardware devices. So there we have seen different stages of technology. Web 1, which was basically the static web. You could post pages, but you couldn't really interact with them very much. Web 2.0, you have much more possibilities to actually interact with the web. And that's where any of the social media applications, the first versions would fall. But also things like web forums that allow some kind of interactivity with any of the users, whether they're programmers or not. Web 3.0 is really what we've hit some time back, but still new applications are coming out these days, meaning it's anything that's actually called semantic web, network of data, and also the smart interconnected web, where you have the web of things, meaning if I have a smartphone that connects and syncs with my computer, syncs with my television, that syncs with my, I don't know, fridge, etc. So that's where we're going with this. And of course, artificial intelligence comes into this picture as well. And artificial intelligence is a big thing with many applications and many implications as well. So if we look at a little bit more stats, we can say that in 2012, we had about 2.4 billion users. You can look at the stats and you can see that actually while if we were to go back to say 1998, we would have had North America and Europe at the top, but we can see that in 2012, Asia is the first one in terms of connectivity. Lagging behind is Africa in terms of the per capita access to the internet. But even that is evolving. So I wanted to show you the stats from just a couple of years after, I mean 8 years after. You can see that roughly the numbers of connected people has doubled. You can see that Asia, because Asia has, you know, of course, a lot of people connecting. It corresponds to about 50% of all web users. And you can see that Africa actually has caught up and is further up compared to, say, North America, which seems somewhat surprising, knowing that America really was one of the cradles of any of these inventions. Also with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for example, where Tim Berners-Lee is working now. We can see also that cellular connectivity has really transformed some of those stats because people are connecting more and more to the web through smartphones. So if I want to hit very quickly the real major issue I want to tackle here in this webinar, then it would be around the cybersecurity risk assessment. And of course, I'm only giving a small kind of summary of of something that could be, you know, an entire class. But we can ask, you know, what's the risk? Is there a control, a or some controls? Can you live with the residual risk? What is your response plan when services become compromised? So those are open questions you can think about. As digital citizens, and I think this is one of the issues to be tackled, we are asked to be very computer competent, not just because we know how to create an Excel sheet and integrate formulas, and not just because we're supposed to know how to format a Word document, not just because we are supposed to be able to use Google Drive or whatever other application, but because many of these things have larger implications. Here you have a number of different topics. When I develop a seminar around cybersecurity and Webstrategies, I will go into more details about those topics here, going from internet safety, privacy, digital footprints to the self-image, but also issues around copyright and creative credit. Not to put aside topics such as cyber reputation and cyberbullying, which happens in schools, but goes beyond the school system. So, of course, we have many online tools. Here you have just a few of them. Now, when it comes to the cybersecurity risk assessment, we have a whole bunch of threats that come our ways. We have spyware, we have hackers trying to get into our computers, we have viruses that can erase our data. We have the threat of identity theft, meaning somebody stealing our identity, our cyber identity. We have things like worms, like online predators, Trojan horses, which would be a type of virus. It's I mean, not exactly a virus, but it's something that will get into our computer and actually hamper what we can do. We may lose data over any of this. We may lose our identity because we can't log into our previous account anymore, and we lose connections with people we have connected through that identity. So the implications are multifaceted and huge, really. So, of course, if we look at the vectors of any of these possible threats on infrastructure and software, we can see that there are malware, email attachments. So, as a piece of advice, never open an attachment you don't know where it came from. But even if you get a strange message from somebody whom you know, you want to think twice whether you want to open it. And of course, you need a good antivirus system on your computer. Also, in general, I would highly advise that people should have good backup systems, because, you know, piece of hardware is just a piece of hardware, meaning it can break. And whether it's because the power supply unit burns out, or whether the disk at some point just is no longer formattable, it's a major problem. So one of the best practices on the subject and for this, to prevent any data loss, which can be tragic and dramatic at times, is to keep backups. Removable drives are quite good, but you have to, of course, when you get a removable drive USB key from someone, you have to worry about the data that actually is being given and whether that USB drive has been scanned. Because if on the previous computer it was connected to, there was a virus, you may wind up with the virus. So you can have also web application attacks, social network attacks, DDoS issues, social engineering, and the threat through mobile phones. And obviously this is not a anything that ever stops. You always will have new threats, which means you have to constantly kind of keep up to where technology stands and how you can best protect yourself, and obviously having good backups and a good antivirus system and a good firewall are just basic best practices. So this application was downloaded from the internet. Are you sure you want to continue to use it? Well, you know, there's the say that basically there's no free lunch. So I think one of the advisable things on that matter is to actually have a good firewall system, and maybe also a good application that can scan for spyware, to make sure that you don't have spyware transmitting data from your computer to somewhere else when you're not aware. Then encryption. Of course, it always depends how confidential the information is you are managing and sometimes transmitting. If you work for a company that deals with highly confidential corporate secrets, because it's sensitive and it shouldn't be shared and you don't get into it, then probably working with encryption software is a good thing to do. In that case, depending on the piece of software that's being used, you will need to ask the recipient who will get the information you're going to transmit to also install the encryption software, which, you know, sometimes it can be a pain in the neck a little bit, but it can be good practice. So this is a method for securing data by using special mathematical algorithms to convert the data into a scrambled set of figures and a scrambled code before it actually gets transmitted. And at the other end, it'll do the same thing to decode it. So here, roughly, this is what I just said already: maintaining data backup, creating effective firewall, making sure that you don't take shortcuts when it comes to actually backing up your information and having a proper data protection on your computer and antivirus on your on your computer. Some good tips as well, best practices would be: do not use the same password for all accounts, do not use birth dates and other easily guessable passwords, not very good practice. And change your passwords regularly. Of course, we all know that that's sometimes a hassle because we can't remember what password we've used in the past, and so every time we have to set a new one, and then we have to retrieve the password because we can't remember it. You know, all of that. Obviously, if you write down your password somewhere, you do have storage places specifically for passwords that are encrypted. Personally, I've not used one of these systems, but I know that some of my colleagues are using it, and depending on how you manage your information, it can be a good idea. Use multiple step verification where possible. So that's a good one, because if you have your smartphone plus your computer, more and more, especially banking systems and others, will use this kind of multi-step verification processes. Well, an antivirus is only as good as its updates. And I think that's applicable for any kind of technology, because if it's not up to date, it won't work very well. And by the way, that's the same also for if you've ever been in a position, or if you might be in a position of managing a website, make sure that if you're using a content management system, a CMS, that any of the modules you have installed are up to date, because if they're not, that is another source of intrusion or possibility of intrusion, because there are security leaks possible. That's the point I was just making here. Keep your website plugins up to date. Don't click on links from unknown sources. Do not store sensitive passwords in the browser. That's another one, very important actually. We have tendency to think that if we have a computer in our bedroom, it must be as, you know, basically local and in our bedroom. Well, no, if it's connected to the internet, intrusions are possible. If we store passwords in the browser and somebody gets into our browser and does what is called phishing, they may retrieve our passwords and use them in order to get into our different accounts and then make them unusable. Always make sure that you logged out of using a public computer. That if you use a cyber cafe, for example, do not leave Gmail open or whatever other email application. If you see something strange with your computer, clear the history and change passwords. You know, you can clear history also when you use public computers. If you're ever in a hotel because you've been traveling and then, you know, you go down to the cyber cafe, clear history and do that again at the end of your session. So, you know, here are some practical tips again, kind of some of which I've mentioned already. Maybe something I can say about VPN. You know, that VPN basically uses generic IP addresses. And so, for example, if you want to connect from a country, but then get access to certain information that's only available in another country, you can use VPN applications. Wi-Fi is wonderful, but Wi-Fi, of course, also can be a source of security breach. And when you see SMS notifications, just pay attention to them, especially when it's connected to any financial elements. Pins and such different passwords. Make sure, you know, you log off at the end. Make sure that you do understand that, in fact, technology is only as good as basically also the users are who are using it. And clearly, the World Wide Web is wonderful. It gives you access to the world. I mean, look at us. We're sitting here on 3 different continents, and we're talking to each other and we're seeing each other. So that's a wonderful thing. But of course, that has a downside, and we just have to understand that basic kinds of measures can resolve or avoid big issues. Here I have a couple of references. I've taken information for this presentation. I don't know if you have any questions at this point, and you may use obviously your microphone if you so do. We've got a little bit gone over time because we said it would be half an hour, but we also started a bit late. So I don't know if you have any questions, if I can add anything, if anything was not clear.
Well, I'm sorry, I will have to ask just a simple question. There's so many, cybersecurity has been an issue for so many organizations and companies. However, there have been approaches like maintaining comprehensive incident response plan. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. However, yes. I want to know, how is that really applicable to organizations that have large staff, like large numbers of staff?
You know what? I think actually that is probably even more applicable to organization staff that have many staff members.
Okay.
Because you see, when you have a small team, it's easy to work with the team to put in place a certain number of basics. When you have 50, 100, I don't know how many are working in your company, but if you have a large company, then you will have people with different levels of computer literacy. And sometimes people not thinking that they would do anything that they shouldn't do, yet for them to jeopardize the entire IT system. So which is why IT people in larger organizations tend to put in place those kinds of processes, and why they will tend to limit the possibilities of simple quote end quote end users, for example, to install applications on their computers, etc. Simply because if they don't know what they're doing, it can jeopardize the entire network.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Do you think parameter defense is applicable to individual security? Like firewalls and all this, do you think it's applicable to individual security? Like you've been talking about more of individual security, home security for cyber hacking and insecurities that are going on. Do you think parameter defense as a module or as a solution is applicable to individual cybersecurity? Is a solution to that, or it's only applicable to companies?
I mean, that is maybe more applicable to companies, but certainly firewalls are absolutely applicable to individuals. I mean, you can have a firewall system, whatever antivirus you use. You know, there are many out there. I don't necessarily want to mention a single brand, but many of the current solutions these days have the possibility of having simple antivirus plus firewall. And I mean, the firewall part actually prevents cyber attacks. And you know that basically attacks are happening all the time, everywhere. So in order to protect yourself, you have to actually have a firewall.
Thank you.
Especially if you're managing a tiny or a huge network. It goes from, you know, very small to very large. And the larger the network, obviously, the bigger the staff, presumably, who will handle those kinds of matters. So if you have a large company, you'll have, you know, an IT department dealing with some of these issues. But even if you just have a home computer that's connected to the web, you have to worry about those issues as well. Because you have an IP address, and from the moment on when you have an IP address, depending on the service provider who gives you the internet access, you know, they will have some screening and certain services installed, but regardless of any of that, you still have to have your own computer and your own computer network protected. and simple antivirus is a good start. But my recommendation would be to have Firewall and, you know,
Okay.
subscription. Anything else?
That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leticia, for your questions. Pamela, any questions?
I'm doing a lot of thinking, but I haven't come to a question yet.
No worries. Then, if there's nothing else you would like to request, I just have one more thought. And then I have my email address if you want to send me any questions, if any come up. You know, obviously we're talking about the World Wide Web. We're talking about cyber out there in space somehow. You know, sometimes actually being transmitted through satellites or cable or, you know, different technologies. At the end of the day, any of this comes down to a reflection of who we are and down to one planet. There are close to 8 billion of us. There is one planet and one ecosystem. And I think what is fascinating to me regarding the web is that in many ways the web reflects that wealth of information, that wealth of languages, that wealth of incredible diversity we have in this world. But also it reflects the best and the worst. And I think we can see that when we scan through the news. We can see that when we go, you know, onto any kind of search engine and we search for something. We could see that also if we go into the dark web, which is basically web that's kind of underground. So again, we have one planet and one ecosystem. We have, well, this is an old stat, I mean, from 2017, with 7.5 billion people and an estimated 11.2 billion in 2100. So that's humanity. And in many ways, the web reflects humanity. So we can think about what that means and the best we want to make out of that, using the web in the best possible way, protecting ourselves, but also reaching out to others and developing many wonderful projects, learning one from another, exchanging and growing together. I think those would be sort of my conclusive final words for this session. But if you have anything you want to add to what I just said, please do so.
Thank you so much for that facilitation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for your participation. Lovely seeing you. Have a wonderful day.
Likewise, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.